Welcome to the fourth lecture of the BU Institute for Philosophy and Religion 2022 Fall Lecture Series, The End of the University. My name is David DeCosimo, and I'm Director of the Institute and Associate Professor of Theology and Ethics at BU School of Theology. The IPR, the Institute, was founded over 50 years ago by a group of philosophers, religion scholars, and theologians who had been teachers of MLK and who, in the face of increasing specialization in the university and a move within philosophy especially toward a vision of philosophy as technical reason rather than love of wisdom, had wanted to secure a place institutionally for questions to continue to be asked and explored of the very sort that lead people to philosophy and religion in the first place, including, not least, questions about God. And so here we are on an election night, so I'm told, an election in which some, accurately or not, claim democracy is at stake. And yet, rather than doom scrolling social media, hitting refresh on our browser, or watching MSNBC or Fox News, here we are. We're doing something different, something ancient. We're sitting and we're about to listen to someone reflect on questions about what it means to be human, what it means to go after the truth, and what virtue might have to do with all of it. I can't think of a better way to honor the vision of the founders of this institute than for us to engage in that together. And I can't think of a better person to lead us in that and to learn from than our lecturer and speaker tonight, Professor Jennifer Frey. Dr. Frey is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of South Carolina, where she's also the Peter and Bonnie McCausland Faculty Fellow in the College of Arts and Sciences. Prior to her appointment at USC, she was Collegiate Assistant Professor of Humanities at the University of Chicago, and before that, she received her Ph.D. from the legendary philosophy department at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Frey's scholarly work ranges across moral and political philosophy and focuses especially on virtue theory, philosophy of action, and moral psychology. She's a leading figure in the ongoing renaissance of Aristotelian and Thomistic virtue theory that was inaugurated by the likes of Philippa Foot, Elizabeth Anscombe, and Alistair MacIntyre. Her articles in these fields are outstanding. She's edited 3 volumes across these areas, most recently with Candace Vogler, Self-Transcendence and Virtue, published by Routledge in 2020. An accomplished essayist, Professor Frey has had work appear in venues such as The Point, Fair Forward, Law and Liberty, USA Today, and very soon, The Wall Street Journal. She was a principal investigator on a multi-million-dollar, multi-year grant from the John Templeton Foundation entitled Virtue, Happiness, and the Meaning of Life. Professor Frey, not least, is also the creator and host of the popular and widely acclaimed podcast, Sacred and Profane Love. And there are some brochures and stickers over there for you to grab if you'd like. The podcast explores and unearths connections between literary art, virtue, and questions about what it means to be a human. And as an aside, I would especially recommend her episode on James Baldwin with Dr. Cornell West, one of my former teachers, and an incredible person to have in conversation with Dr. Frey. Dr. Frey is at once a creative and careful moral philosopher of the first rate and a public intellectual with a rare gift for awakening people to the beauty of intellectual life and calling them, through reflection on and conversation about literature and poetry, to more deeply engage the most important questions about this world and their own place in it. Indeed, when I reflect about fellow scholars and citizens writing and thinking about the end of the university, about what this institution is and what it should be, and more fundamentally about learning itself, I struggle to name anyone who's casting a more courageous, compelling, or ethically serious vision. I'm deeply excited for our chance to learn from and think with her about how inquiry and learning can be sites for formation into virtue. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Frey as she lectures on liberal learning and love of truth.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And yeah, it's election night. I'm glad you're here. There'll be plenty of time to stare at screens later. But I want to talk about liberal learning, the liberal arts, and how they ought to be grounded in the love of truth. So the question of this lecture series concerns the end of the university. And when we talk about ends, we're asking a teleological question. First and foremost, we're asking about the defining point or purpose or goal of the university as such. We are talking about a goal that both defines something and measures it, right? So when we talk about the end of the university, we're talking about what defines the sorts of activities that we're doing here and also provides a measure of those activities. In virtue of what sort of activities? Do we say that an incorporated group of persons or collective is a university, right? As opposed to a hospital or a prison or a legislature, or more simply put, just a school. As members of a university, what activities are we engaged in that belong essentially to us as members of it? Or, to put it in the bluntest possible terms, why are we here, right? Now, you might think that there isn't any defining end or goal of a university, that it simply does many different things and it serves many different purposes. You might even think that it's simply a matter of consumer choice, what the point or purpose of a university education is. After all, you pay the money, so you get to decide what you want out of it. Maybe you simply want to make good connections, find a wealthy spouse, and be a person who lunches. And so you will pick the easiest possible degree, you will work as little as possible to earn this degree, and you will just try to find an amazing college experience, right? Maybe you want to develop as an athlete so that you can go on to play professional sports, and so your degree is simply something that allows you to advance your athletic career. Maybe you are simply here for the shiny credentials that everyone keeps telling you you have to have in order to get ahead and to make money. I am certainly not denying that people come to a university with all sorts of different goals in mind and that they get all sorts of different goods from it, okay? That's the reality. And on some level, there's nothing wrong with this, right? It's fine. It's just that I'm asking a different question, and it's less a question of individual psychology and more a question about the nature of this institution and its self-understanding and how this self-understanding makes sense of how the institution organizes and presents itself. I'm asking whether the university has, at least in theory, any essential structure, such that we can say that all of the various goods that the university offers for its students, that there is one defining or ultimate good that gives the other goods their sense as it were goods that the university offers, as opposed to some other institution. Now, I do think that the university has an essential defining end or purpose that, in the ideal case, all other ends are subordinate to. And that end is truth. I will try to explain and make this claim more specific as I go along, but that is my basic thesis, right? The defining end and aim of a university is the possession of truth. What we come to the university to do together as a community of learners is to search for the truth together as our common good. And we do this in the best possible way when we do it for its own sake and not for the sake of any other good that we have in mind. And I think that everything else that a university does, and of course it does many things, should ultimately be for the sake of the pursuit of truth as our common end. And I think it follows from this that if the university does anything to prevent or impede this essential goal of possessing the truth, then it betrays itself as a university and ceases to act in a way that it befits a university to act. Okay, so like I said, I want to I just sort of state my thesis boldly, and I want to sort of unpack it as I go along. But the first thing that I want to do is talk in a general way about education and human virtue, because a lot of what I want to say about university education kind of follows from things that I would say about education generally. So, and again, here I'll just make some claims, and we can talk later about whether or not you buy into them. But my starting point, the starting point of my reflection, is that education is cultivation. It's the cultivation of human nature, transforming it from mere potentiality to the realization of actual concrete human excellence. When we talk about human excellence, we are talking about what we are given by nature and the development and cultivation of that into a certain characteristic, recognizable shape. Another starting point of mine is that education is mostly the process of habituation. Now, I think, along with many sort of classical thinkers, that it belongs to rational creatures such as ourselves to develop habits. That this is basic even to human survival. A habit is a kind of development or formation of a human capacity so that it's oriented towards specific actions that we can recognize. You can kind of see a pattern. And habits are not simply desirable for us, they are necessary. And they are necessary because many human abilities are simply not well formed enough on their own to generate the kinds of actions that are in fact essential to human life. And the human capacities that become habituated are those that are responsive to and dependent upon reason for their complete operation. So what we notice when we kind of reflect philosophically on human life, that there's kind of a gap between the natural orientation of human capacities and its actual use, and habits kind of fill up the gap, again, by orienting us or disposing us to certain operations rather than to others. For instance, just to take a very obvious example, the human is a language using animal, okay? We not only have the capacity to use and learn a language, but human life sort of proceeds in a fundamental way linguistically. But of course, you also have to learn a specific language, right? And there are many such specific languages, and that means that you need to develop a habit. I have the habit of reading Latin, though I'm not currently using this habit. But I have the habit. I could use it if I needed to. This particular habit was hard fought, and it took me many years to attain. It was not easy for me. If I went too long without using this habit, I would surely lose it. I assumed that I would lose it. So maybe reading Latin is not like riding a bike, which is also a habit. But my main point is this. Humans need habits, okay? And the only interesting question is whether these habits will be good or bad. A proper education, a good education, involves good habituation, right? It instills the skills and virtues that are necessary in order for someone to lead a flourishing or a happy human life. And virtues, in particular, are a specific kind of good habit. They are the good habits that perfect human capacities by disposing them to excellent operation so that we can live well. unqualified, right? So we're not just talking about skills that help you in certain areas of life, right? Like you can bake well, or you can, I don't know, you're good at French cooking or something like this. Virtues are not forms of expertise, but they enable you to live well, period, unqualified. They are stable dispositions of thought, action, and feeling that are necessary for human flourishing, and that dispose you so that you are fit to live well in community with other persons and to pursue common goods with other persons together. Now, for a very long time, it was simply taken for granted that education is formation, that it is the development of good habits, and that its ultimate goal is human flourishing. We've lost this vision of education, but I'm not going to argue for it. I'm simply telling you that I believe it's correct. And it's my starting point. It's a starting point for my reflections. I've written a lot about this view of education. If you're interested, I can point you to things that I've written. But for tonight, it's just my starting point. And it's my starting point because if you don't grant me this conception of education, nothing else that I'm going to say is going to be terribly convincing. So just for the sake of argument, just enter into a certain kind of reflection with me. Okay, so I think we all more or less realize at the level of common sense that education comes in unique stages, right? And it also begins from infancy. There are some things that tiny humans will do as a matter of instinct, right? And that they will sort of naturally come to do, even if sort of left to their own devices. So if you have to teach an infant to crawl, or to walk, there's already something wrong. Okay, you don't have to teach them to crawl or walk. They will just start doing this at some point on their own accord, eventually, right? But we have like a pretty good sense of when this should start happening, such that, if you have a 10-month-old infant who isn't moving, it's sort of like a potted plant just sitting there, probably something is wrong. They will also learn to use a language, at least on some very rudimentary level, so long as they are consistently exposed to one. Of course, we can and must help them along so that they can excel in communication. That's important. And then, of course, we have to train them to do all sorts of things, even to get them to the place where they can go to a formal school, like use the toilet, learn manners, tie their shoes, hold a pencil, etc. All of this takes time and patience, but children are apt to learn these things, right? Whereas if you tried to teach your dog to learn English, it's probably not going to go very far. Some of what we teach children is simply a matter of their survival, and that's important. We have to habituate them into what they should recognize as dangerous and bad and to be avoided, and also what is good and pleasant and to be pursued and how best to pursue it. But no one thinks that mere survival is the goal of education, or at least I've never met anyone who put forward such a line. We also want young people to be productive members of a community. And so we seek to educate them into certain skills that enable them to belong to and participate in communal life. We want them to be useful, right? And finally, I hope that we want young people to flourish, to pursue and enjoy the activities that are not good because of something else that they provide, either for themselves or for others, but simply good in themselves. And here, for example, I'm thinking of the arts, both folk arts and fine arts, depending on your tastes, and also, of course, the contemplative life. Now, with this last category, I am carving out space for an education that goes beyond utility. And that means that I think our usefulness to one another is not the proper limit of our potential or our value. It belongs to the human person that we can and want to pursue what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful simply for its own sake. To say this, and to say it without hesitation or embarrassment, is to recognize that we are made for more than a life of work. That you are made for more than a life of work. What do I mean by that? Well, work is a space of instrumental value and instrumental rationality. Instrumental rationality is fundamental and important, and it's recognizable, right? You do A because you need B and C. You do B and C because you need D and E, and so on, and so on, and so on, right? That's the space of utility. But what do we do with ourselves when we are not busy fulfilling basic needs? What do we do in our tempo libero, our leisure, or our free time? Hopefully it is not simply a time to rest up so that we can get back to work, but more of a time to fully realize our potential, to achieve forms of human excellence just for their own sake. When we think about how to use our leisure time, our free time, we are thinking about what our highest aspirations are, and what sorts of activities shall a good human life culminate, and what sorts of activities should my life culminate. What are the highest human aspirations? Another way to pose the question, what is all the work for? What's it for? What are you working for? And if all you can say, right, is something that turns out to be more work, I think you have a problem, right? A higher education, if it's meaningfully higher and not simply higher in its costs, financial and opportunity, should be addressing this question and should be preparing its students to answer it head on, right? Where the question is, in what sorts of activities shall my life culminate? Now, I believe that the answer to this question comes by way of self-knowledge, of understanding who and what we are essentially as human persons, and then also understanding ourselves as particular individuals with certain gifts and talents. Now, in the opening to his Metaphysics, Aristotle very famously says the following. How many people have read Aristotle? Any Aristotle? Okay, excellent. You may be familiar with this, I don't know. All men by nature desire to know. And an indication of this is the delight we take in our senses. For even apart from their usefulness, they are loved for themselves, and above all others, the sense of sight. For not only with a view to action, but even when we are not doing anything at all, we prefer sight to almost anything else. The reason is that this, most of all the senses, makes us know and brings to light the differences of things. Now, in some sense, all of philosophy flows from this little paragraph in Aristotle, because what he's saying is that philosophy begins in wonder. We long and we yearn to understand reality, to know, as Aristotle puts it, the why and the causes. And this does make us unique from other animals who also see, who also have sight, but are not quite as enthralled with the differences of things. And we long to understand not for bodily pleasure. I don't think knowledge yields any specific kind of phenomenological bodily pleasure that I could meaningfully speak of, or for utility, even though knowledge can be very useful, but in itself. Metaphysics, which Aristotle describes as the science of being qua being, tries to hit upon the most fundamental features of reality. Aristotle did not undertake this inquiry because he thought it would be useful or pleasant. What Aristotle wanted was wisdom. Now, we're not teaching metaphysics in elementary school. It would enter into things at a much later stage in education once we have what Dorothy Sayers calls the more fundamental tools of learning in place. But when we're talking about higher education, we're talking about higher forms of cultivation of this desire to know, this desire to possess the truth. This takes more than the cultivation of our intellects or our minds. It takes more than what Aristotle would call intellectual virtue or good habits of mind. It also requires what Aristotle calls moral virtue, or what St. Augustine called well-ordered loves. But what I want to focus on tonight is this, and that is that without well-habituated love for the truth, our study will be fruitless. Without love of truth as our highest end, our study ends up being yoked to ends outside itself, and it thereby becomes a kind of work or drudgery rather than an expression of our highest and deepest aspirations. And without well-habituated love of truth, we will become neither happy nor wise. For while we are ordered to truth by nature, we need to recognize that some things are more worthy of our study than others. And a higher education needs to direct our attention to higher forms of study, right? It needs to not only show us, right, what is most worthy of being known, but it must connect that study to this natural desire that we have to know the truth. So we must not only love and seek the truth, but do it well. And to do it well, of course, like to do anything well in human life, requires virtue. But before we get to virtue, I want to start with something a little bit more basic, and that is the question of truth, right? What is truth? I've said that you have a natural desire to seek it, but what is it? Thomas Aquinas says that truth is the good of the intellect. And by that he means that any intellectual act, judging, perceiving, understanding, etc., is the sort of act that essentially aims at the truth, that truth is its defining goal or end. And that just means that a good intellectual act is measured by truth, which is its end. And a bad one misses this mark and is false, right? More specifically, Aquinas says the intellect relates one to being, to things other than the intellect, by way of truth. So, for example, to know that the city of Boston is in the state of Massachusetts is to be related to reality in the appropriate way. This is how Aquinas puts it. He says it's an adequatio between the intellect and the thing. Now, I'm going to try to put that kind of scholastic formulation in more contemporary terms. So we might just say that belief, for example, is transparent to the truth. This is a claim made by a philosopher down the road at Harvard, Dick Moran. So here's kind of how to think about it. From the first person perspective of your experience as someone who has beliefs, you treat the question of your belief about any proposition or your assertion of any proposition as equivalent to the question of the truth of that proposition. So that means that if you're deliberating about whether to believe or to assert that P, you're deliberating about whether it is the case that the world is the way you think or say that it is. The activity of theoretical deliberation and inquiry is, quite frankly, unintelligible without reference to the truth. It is a search, and that search will succeed only insofar as it reaches its object. And in the case of truth, that's only insofar as reality is actually penetrated by your mind and the truth is secured through an intellectual act. So, in order to convince you of this, because I know that people are allergic to truth talk, just think about the following claim. Imagine someone who's like standing at a window and they see that it's raining. And then imagine that same person, while they're looking at the rain coming down, having the thought, I don't believe that it's raining. This doesn't really seem possible prima facie, right? And it should strike you as a kind of absurdity, right? For someone to see that it's raining and then say, I don't believe that it's raining. So there's a philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who argues the following. He says, if there were a verb meaning to believe falsely, it would not have any significant first-person present indicative, right? That is, there would be no role in the language for people to say, I believe X falsely. It would have no use. And the reason for this is that to believe something is simply to have settled the question for yourself about the way you think things are. So from the first-person perspective, the perspective of someone who thinks about what to believe and who forms beliefs, the commitment to something beyond your own individual psychological perspective is unavoidable. Because to believe and to judge is to transcend your own perspective. It is to put yourself in relation to things and to be held accountable to them. All this is to say, you're a truth seeker. And this is not by choice. This is by nature. This is just how you are. And so I don't think it's wrong to say that the question of truth is inescapable for us, because even if you try to say there is no truth, some people try to say this, in saying there is no truth, you are trying to say something true. That is to say, you are trying to say something that you think demands the rational assent of your listeners, right? There is no truth. Also, think that thought with me, right? If I say it, I want you to believe it too. It's not just a power move, right? And this is kind of an interesting thing about belief is you can't really force people to believe something. You can force people to say things. You can force people to assert things, but you can't really make them believe it. And I find that interesting. Okay, so a human person is directed upon things by way of knowing them and desiring them, by knowledge and by love. That is the specifically human way of kind of interacting with things in the world. Now, I've already talked about the goal of intellectual acts as being to attain or possess the truth, which is the good of the intellect, by way of understanding and knowledge, and in the highest case, wisdom. But now I want to talk about desire. I want to talk about the will. What is the will? The will is our capacity to intend and to choose actions in accordance with our deliberative knowledge of how we think we ought to live. And in intending and choosing and doing things voluntarily, we are aiming to possess the good. Now, whereas truth is in the mind, so we speak of true beliefs or true judgments, goodness is in things, right? And so the will and intending and choosing sort of moves towards possessing the goodness in things. We choose something insofar as we think it's good, in some respect, under some description that you can give that explains your choice. You are picking out what you think is good in the thing. You want a good friend, or you want a good cookie, where that means that you are drawn to something in the friend that you think is good, a good companion, a good conversation partner, or something in the cookie that's good. It's super yummy. You're hungry. It'll satisfy your hunger, etc. Now here's where some more philosophical distinctions matter. Truth can also be something that the will desires, even though truth is the good of the intellect. I can want to know the truth about what happened on January 6th, or I can want to know the truth about prime numbers, and I can choose to do what is necessary to attain the truth in these subjects. When Aquinas talks about the will and the intellect, the specifically rational forms of knowing and wanting, he talks about how they involve one another in their activity. So I just want to kind of briefly rehearse how this works. So, because the picture is one of interdependence and kind of interpenetration. So, on the one hand, when you're talking about desire, desires always have an object. You always desire something. You don't just like experience desires. Like I just have an aching. I know not for what. You always want something, right? Now, it's kind of a common sense view, but also something that Aristotle argues for specifically, is that any form of desire gets its object from cognition. There has to be some cognitive act, right? Some seeing or knowing of what it is good for you to pursue. Now, when we're talking about a rational form of desire, we're talking about the will. It gets its object from an intellectual act. In most cases, a deliberative judgment, this is the thing to pursue here and now in these circumstances for whatever reason. This is what makes the will different from lower forms of desires that human beings also have. These are desires that are elicited from sense perceptions. So imagine the following case. You smell something totally gross, and you just have, an aversion, a kind of physical aversion to it. That aversion is kind of a gut reaction. It's a sense reaction. But now let's imagine that the gross smelling substance is medicine, and that you are sick and you want to get better, and you know that the medicine will help you get better, right? So you take the medicine in spite of your very strong sensory aversion to it because it smells gross, right? This higher desire is what I'm talking about when I talk about will, right? It's that higher desire, that choice to take the medicine, even though it's disgusting. And we have both kinds of desires in us, but both kinds of desires get their objects from cognition. The gut aversion comes from a sense perception, smell, right? The will, the choice, comes from a deliberative judgment. Okay, so that's one direction. That is the intellect moving the will, right? But it goes the other way, right? The will moves the intellect and the senses. And I think this is really important. So, and the reason that I think this is really important is because I think that so much of the moral life, so much of your life, is about where you direct your attention. And where you direct your attention isn't so much a reflection of your mind, although it will shape your mind, but it's a matter of what you want, of what you love. And there are two women that write very movingly and convincingly about directed attention, and those two women are Iris Murdoch and Simone Weil. And I highly recommend reading both of those women philosophers. But the roots of this idea go way back to Plato and are particularly compelling in Plato and Augustine. But your attention is directed by your loves. So what do I want to see? What do I want to hear? What specifically do I desire to know, right? That's all, in a way, well, that's a matter of desire, right? And moreover, there's this idea that not all knowledge is on a par, okay? So you could memorize the phone book, and if you memorize the phone book, in a way, it would be impressive, and you would have knowledge. But I also think you would have done something pretty absurd. Like, I think, there would be questions about why you were spending your time memorizing the phone book. So it's not, that's not wisdom, right? That's not knowledge that's really worth pursuing. So if we recognize that what we investigate depends on what we desire to know, and that not all knowledge is of equal value, then in some sense we recognize that our desire for knowledge itself needs to be formed and shaped, right? That appetite for knowledge that is natural to man in the sense of anthropos, That has to be cultivated just as much as any other human capacity if it's going to lead to real human excellence. And so it's part of this tradition that we need to moderate this appetite for knowledge so that it is well ordered, so that we direct our attention to objects and forms of inquiry that are most worthy of it. What sort of knowledge and truth we seek is a reflection of what we love, which is a reflection of our character. This is why Aquinas says that the contemplative life is grounded in caritas, the virtue of charity, that perfects the will. Whether or not we believe that divine charity is a virtue, we will set aside for now because the point is more basic. The point is that our study is a reflection of what we love, and it cannot be understood apart from it. Study is not dispassionate, right? Study is not disinterested. And anyone who tells you that it is, or even worse, that it should be, I think is just incorrect. Okay, so now I want to talk about learning or study. So learning implies teaching, whereas I think study does not, but I'm going to be a little bit sloppy and use them more or less interchangeably. What matters to me is that both are understood in relation to the search for truth, right? So my friend Zena Hitz, who's a philosopher, has written a really wonderful book called Lost in Thought, The Hidden Pleasures of the Intellectual Life. And I really recommend this book. And it basically gives an account of the love of learning as natural and as the best use of our leisure, of what we do when we are free from the tyranny of results or outcomes. And Zena talks about the quote, seeing and understanding and savoring of the world as it is, right? Of contemplation as one of the highest human activities. And I think she's right about this, and I think it's a wonderful book, but she never talks about truth. Indeed, she never even mentions truth in her book about the love of learning. And when I asked her about this, she said that talk of truth alienates people, and so she wanted to avoid it. And this is a very common move among professors in the humanities today. We tend to avoid talk of truth as if we are vaguely embarrassed of it. And this is not the case in the sciences. They are not afraid to talk of truth and of saying that what they say is true. Instead of talking about truth, we tend to talk about meaning or interpretation or understanding. But we shy away from any idea of an ultimate standard against which to measure our intellectual activity. But I would like to put my stake in the sand and say we cannot understand the activities of learning or study or scholarship apart from truth. When we talk about communities of learning, the common activity is the search for a common end, which is the truth. We have understanding not simply when we can recite a true answer or a true proposition, but when we understand the why and the causes, when we can give an account, right? And if we love learning, and if we have a natural desire to know, then what we have, by definition, is a desire for the truth, because truth is the good of the intellect. So I think we can't avoid talk about truth when we talk about learning and when we talk about study. But what is study, really? Aquinas has a very capacious account of study. Study is simply the vehement application of mind to something. Right? That doesn't imply school. While you may be forced to study in compulsory education, for Aquinas, study is best understood as voluntary and free. We can study anything, blades of grass, rocks, souls, the history of human events, and so on. And we can distinguish between contemplative study and practical study. My teenagers are currently studying the driver's manual for the state of South Carolina. Are they learning obscure rules of the road for its own sake? Absolutely not. The knowledge is entirely instrumental to their ends. They want to pass the test so they can get their learner's permit. They want their learner's permits, they don't have to rely on mom, and so that they have more freedom. All kinds of study and learning is just like that. It's practical. It's a means to an end. That's real study. It's real learning, right? But there's a different kind of learning and study, what I would call contemplative study, and that's study undertaken in leisure for no other reason than to know the truth of things. Such study can be undertaken in any context, but it is the sort of study that is at the heart of any education that claims to be higher, of any education that claims to be liberal or free. This would be the sort of study that is undergone in what the old days we used to call the studium generale, or the university. But before I get to liberal learning, I want to draw a connection between study and human flourishing, or human happiness. So I've spoken about a natural desire to know, grounded in the fact that we are creatures with intellect and will who are ordered to seek the truth. And this means that seeking the truth has to be central to human flourishing, or living a happy life. After all, if our minds are left uncultivated and woefully lacking in their natural end, it is difficult to think of how we can speak of living well. Therefore, any conception of living well that leaves study out will be woefully incomplete. In fact, Aquinas and Aristotle will go even further. So Aquinas argues that for the human, there is no higher end than truth, and there is no more noble pursuit than the pursuit of truth. He says, no desire carries us on to such sublime heights as the desire to understand the truth. Let those men be ashamed, then, who seek human happiness in inferior things, when it is so highly situated. Here he agrees with the famous formulation of St. Augustine, that St. Augustine gives in his Confessions, that happiness is joy or delight in the truth, that the will is fulfilled when the intellect reaches its good. That's kind of the teaching of the perennial philosophy. You'll find the same thing in Aristotle. Now, in kind of a very quick, mild defense of this, I will turn to an atheist, one of the most important physicists of the last century, and that is Steven Weinberg. When he was asking, back in the 90s, when he was asking governments to fund research into particle physics, research that is insanely expensive, he did not want to go along with utilitarian forms of reasoning. He thought the government should pony up the enormous funds, not because such research would be useful, although of course it surely would be useful in a bunch of ways, but simply because the quest for a final theory is, in his own words, the noblest effort of mankind. It is worth thinking about why even an atheist would say this. And all I will say for the moment is that I think the account will come not from particle physics, but from a proper understanding of human nature or essence. And I think it's so interesting that this man who was so famous for advancing particle physics had this insight into himself. Okay, and there's another reason why we should be dedicated to the truth, and that one concerns how to live well, right? Unless we are first and foremost dedicated to the pursuit of truth, it is difficult to surmise how we could possibly live well, because we will not know how to order our lives or how to use our gifts, talents, or treasures. Suppose that you have amassed a great amount of wealth, power, and leisure time. You are still faced with the question, what do you use it for? What's it for? Without truth and without wisdom and without even the slightest idea, right, of how to even approach the question, you have nowhere to go. At best, you can rely on the testimony of others, but you won't understand for yourself, right? You won't understand for yourself, and that seems like a lack, right? It seems like you can look at that and say something is missing for this person. Okay, so now I want to move, and this is my final section, I promise. I want to talk about liberal learning and the liberal arts. And of course, the idea of the liberal arts goes back at least to Aristotle. So Aquinas, in his commentary on Aristotle's metaphysics, Aquinas was one of the great commentators on Aristotle. He writes the following. He says, only those arts are called liberal or free, which are concerned with knowledge. Those which are concerned with utilitarian ends that are attained through activity, however, are called servile. Servile is the language Aristotle used to highlight the fact that the servile arts are instrumental and belong in the space of work. They are a means to an already specified end within some practical domain. He could have simply called them the useful arts, but he didn't, because he thought there was an element of human freedom lacking in them. And that is because in the servile arts, the end is closed and already defined. One's reasoning and choices are subordinate to it from the start. But there is something higher than instrumental value. It is the value of an end which is good in itself, or choice-worthy in itself. And so again, a liberal education, a higher education, is concerned with this higher sort of knowledge, right? Which is also, and this is important to this tradition, it's more universal. If what we want is wisdom, we will search for the highest causes, the most universal causes, and we will try to understand how everything else is related to it. So I want to really briefly contrast this kind of old-timey conception of the liberal arts with that put forward recently by Harvard professor Louise Menand in The New Yorker. So in a recent piece in which he's arguing against Roosevelt Montas at Columbia, if that name means anything to you, he wrote a really wonderful book called Rescuing Socrates about his own personal search for truth, how love of learning changed his life and brought him out of poverty and into the academy. It's a beautiful, beautiful, powerful book that Professor Menand didn't seem to like very much. So he says the following in The New Yorker about a liberal education. He says, a liberal education should have nothing to do with, quote, ruminations on the state of souls, or, quote, the nature of a good life. Liberal education means free and disinterested. It means that inquiry is pursued without fear or favor, regardless of the outcome and whatever the field of study, and that universities exist simply to protect that freedom to be disinterested. That's really revealing, right, of a very different account of the liberality of the liberal arts, I guess I would say. And it should be obvious where I disagree with Menand. Liberal learning should, of course, be free from fear about outcomes, but it should not be disinterested or dispassionate, and in fact, it cannot be. It should be pursued for its own sake, but from a love of and dedication to the truth, come what may, right? A love of and dedication to the truth, come what may. The freedom that is cultivated by the liberal arts is an interior freedom and rests upon the idea that without truth, we can neither be free nor happy. Now, liberal education, I believe, is best pursued in a community. And that has to do with the nature of the pursuit of truth. And here, I'm kind of drawing on John Henry Newman. John Henry Newman was a Victorian thinker who gave a series of lectures in the middle of the 19th century that today is a book called The Idea of a University. And I think it's a great book. And what's really interesting is that John Henry Newman, who was a cardinal of the Catholic Church, gives an account of the essence of the university that sounds pretty secular, right? So he says, a university is an institution that is dedicated essentially to seeking and teaching universal knowledge. That's the essence of the university. So what does he mean by universal knowledge? Well, Newman is most concerned that the university be a place where the whole of liberal knowledge gets represented. It is not simply for him that no part of this knowledge can be left out, but that this knowledge must form a whole and be comprehended as a unity. This means that the different disciplines of knowledge that exist in the university would ideally operate in light of one another, that the university must be a society or a community whose members understand themselves as making a contribution to something much greater than themselves, universal knowledge. So Newman argues that, and this is a quote, all that exists as contemplated by the human mind forms one large system or complex fact. And this, of course, resolves itself into an indefinite number of particular facts, which, as being portions of a whole, have countless relations of every kind, one towards another. Now, truth is not simply grasping of facts, but understanding facts in relation to one another as a totality, as part of this comprehensive whole. And here Newman draws on the concept of aletheia in Aristotle, which is sort of like a deep sense truth that goes beyond the mere assertoric truth that I talked about earlier. This deep sense truth carries with it something like a concept of progress. So here's Newman again. The human mind cannot take in this whole vast at a single glance or gain possession of it at once. Like a short-sighted reader, its eye pores closely and travels slowly over the awful volume which lies open for its inspection. Or again, as we deal with some huge structure of many parts and sides, the mind goes round about it, noting down first one thing, then another, as it best may, and viewing it under different aspects by way of making progress towards mastering the whole. So that by degrees and circuitous advances does it rise aloft and subject itself to a knowledge of that universe into which it has been born. So Newman's idea of progress is towards seeing how the parts of truth relate to the greater whole of truth. And behind this idea of truth is a conception of the universe, the totality of being or reality as something that is intrinsically intelligible or knowable by us. There can be no universal knowledge or deep sense truth without this concept of a universe. And for Newman, there can be no university without a universe and universal knowledge. Now, if we accept something like this model of universal knowledge as an ideal towards which the university ought to strive in all of its intellectual endeavors, then we can see how all the disciplines taught within the university ought to bear upon one another. Right, so the various sciences arrange and classify facts, they reduce separate phenomena under common principles, and they trace effects to their causes. Inasmuch as sciences are forms of knowledge, they ought to be able to communicate with other sciences their results in order to contribute to this greater whole. It follows from this that each science then must understand itself to be incomplete without the other sciences in the university, and each must recognize the respects in which the other sciences are also contributing to this greater whole. So for Newman, and this is what is important, the ideal university is a place of sharing knowledge, guided by some kind of regulative ideal of the unity of knowledge. And thus, a citizen of a university understands him or herself not merely as seeking the truth from within sort of your narrow disciplinary silo, but as seeking truth for the sake of contributing to something higher, universal knowledge or wisdom, right? And there's a kind of humility, I think, that is baked into that account. And it's for this reason that Newman says philosophy always has to have a special place in the university. And of course, as a philosopher, I'm going to laud this as the correct position. Ultimately, what Newman wants is for universal knowledge to be communicated in every single university discipline, right? And in order for that to be the case, people need to be trained in thinking philosophically, right? And so he thinks that philosophy and theology, I should say, I'm in the School of Theology. Philosophy and theology have to be an essential part of a general liberal education. Okay, and then of course, when Newman gets around to the question of what universal knowledge is for, right, he, not surprisingly, talks about it in terms of living well no matter what one does after graduation. And this is the greatest advantage of liberal learning. And here's my final quote from Newman. He says, "In such a place devoted to liberal learning, students learn to respect, consult, and aid one another in their search for truth. Students begin to apprehend the great outlines of knowledge, the principles on which it rests, the scale of its parts, its lights and shades, its great points and its little, as he otherwise cannot apprehend them. Hence it is that his education is called liberal. For a habit of mind is formed which lasts through his life, of which the attributes are freedom, equitableness, calmness, moderation, and wisdom, which I have ventured to call philosophical habits. This is the special fruit of the education that is given at a university." So that's the real meaning of liberal, right, is that it makes you free to live well beyond your time at the university. So Newman leaves us with this vision of the university as preparing its students for human flourishing by imparting habits of mind in them that enables them to be truly free and flourish. And I think, we find in Newman some materials for thinking of liberal learning as best pursued in a community of learners that seeks the truth together as a common good. And I think that this is what a university should be. How much time do I have left? Are we? Okay. This is my final thought, I promise. So I don't think that we can just go back, right? And I don't want to just go back in time. I'm not convinced that ancient Athens would have been an especially great place for me as a woman. And I'm not a revolutionary, okay? So I believe that institutional change is best when it comes about slowly and steadily with joint deliberation of all parties involved, right? But I do think that we need to try to find ways to recover real liberal learning in our universities. I think an honors program, for example, is one way to get serious about general liberal education. But whatever changes we try to bring about, we have to try to recover the idea that liberal learning will not be successful unless it springs from and is guided by love for the truth as a common end. We can talk all day about teaching and best practices, but the reality is that the principal cause of learning is in the student himself or herself. It is a fundamentally personal endeavor. So liberal teaching only goes well insofar as teachers can ignite the desire to know by getting a discourse going within the student's own mind and in relation to his or her peers. The student must want to apply his mind to the subject of study, and that means that he must be drawn to the project of seeking the truth rather than credentials, rather than status, rather than power, rather than wealth. The student must long to discourse because he longs to understand. He must not run away from objections to his beliefs because he longs to be confirmed in the truth by proving that he can refute them. At the end of the day, it's not about winning arguments or debates. It's not about impressing anyone. It is something at the very center of a student's personhood, their desire for truth. But this desire will be misdirected without virtue, right? Students need to learn what is worthy of their attention and how to grow in knowledge in a community of learners, right? And so when we talk about running a good classroom, right, don't we need to be talking about civility, about patience, about humility, about integrity, about honesty, about charity and generosity? Aren't these things necessary to pursue the truth as a common end and good? I believe that they are. And I think that an education that is truly higher will put that forward. Thank you for your attention. You made it through a whole hour. I'm impressed. Nobody fell asleep. Or if you did, I didn't notice. So.
Thank you, Dr. Frey, for a terrific and very rich lecture. So we have plenty of time for questions.
Hi, thank you so much for your sharing. Throughout that whole sharing by yourself, you've mentioned the word truth, you've mentioned universal knowledge, but I'm not sure you've ever explained what that means sort of across various aspects of the university. So I guess my question to you would be, what would truth look like in English literature? What would truth look like in economics? What would a legal truth be? Because all of these fields have theories.
Right.
But I'm not quite sure whether they have truth.
Yeah, okay, good. I love that question. That's such a great question. I mean, I can't go through every discipline and explain. And in some disciplines, it would be frankly absurd for me to even attempt. But let's take literature, because I've thought a lot about this, right? So Iris Murdoch, who I mentioned before, and who is a philosopher, a very good philosopher from whom I have learned a great deal. she says that art is cognition in another mode, right? And so she says, the difference between art, cheap art, bad art, and great art is that great art reveals truth, right? And it gives us self-knowledge, right? So let's just take the novel, because I've thought a lot about that. She thinks that a bad novel is a kind of fantasy or illusion, right? And the way that bad novels operate is they invite us to escape reality. Whereas a great novel, like Flaubert's Madame Bovary, for example, is not offering us an escape from reality. And even though nothing that happens in Madame Bovary is true, right? It's not historical. It's not a syllabus of events that happened in, amongst the petite bourgeoisie in a certain place in southern France at a certain time. However, the story of Emma Bovary is a story that reveals a very deep and powerful truth about human beings. And it's interesting. Flaubert once said, Emma Bovary, c'est moi, right? Emma Bovary, that's me. Now, Emma Bovary is clearly not literally Flaubert, right? Emma Bovary is a product of Flaubert's fantastic literary imagination. But Emma Bovary reflects something in all of us, right? Which is our tendency to not be able to deal with reality when reality is painful, and our tendency to want to prefer pleasant illusions to the truth, right? That's what happens to Emma Bovary. And you can see it, like you just see it happening in a story. You see it unfold. And that's the power of great literature, and sort of speaks to some of the limits of philosophy, and one of the reasons why I'm so committed to the idea that moral philosophers in particular need to be in dialogue with literary critics and need to be reading great novels, precisely because, philosophers can give you arguments, and arguments are very important, but arguments are limited, right? Because arguments are general and abstract. What you see in the novel is a deep philosophical truth that gets worked out in a particular story, right? And so the novel is truth revealing according to the mode of a novel, right? According to the mode of its specific kind of art. And I think that I'm so sorry, wow. I'll just stay here and not wander. I think that all art functions this way. I can't go through all of the genres and prove this, but that's my commitment. And I'm getting that from Iris Murdoch and some other people. So I'm not making that up. It's a great question.
Thank you. So I really enjoyed your talk, and I think I'm pretty close to 100% on board with your vision, your vision of what a university should be. Yeah. However, I'm also struck by the huge distance between it and what the university actually is in practice, especially these days. When I think so much of university life really is oriented to servile arts, and the number of people majoring in liberal arts goes down and down, and I wonder how do you propose, or how would you propose putting this vision into practice? How do you reorient university life towards a search for truth, especially when, so many students will graduate with so much debt that they have no choice but to pursue money-oriented ends? Right. Where do you start in fixing it?
Okay, well, let's bracket, the problem of, soaring tuition, because that's probably not a problem of the philosopher. That's probably a problem for the economist, or someone that is good at studying market forces and things like that. So let's bracket that question, though it's important, right? There are non-accidental reasons why parents, for example, are very terrified for their children to study philosophy. In my experience, it's not the students, it's the parents, right? It's the one paying the bills. But let's just bracket that and focus on what I think is the harder question, and that is like, well, what do you propose to do about it, right? And so a lot of people here in the honors program, is that correct? Or a fair number of you? Okay. So I do think that it's best to start small, right? And find something that works, and then you can imitate, and it can grow from there. So I agree with Roosevelt Montas that we need to, even within our research universities, I work at a research university, this is a research university. I bet Professor Wellman probably talked about the German Research University last time. If not, he wrote a book about it, which you should read, called Permanent Crisis. I think that even within the, actually, especially within the research university, we need to once again get serious about general education. So the trend for the past 30 years or so has been to completely water down the gen ed requirements so that, you know, it's not an integrated, holistic thing. It's like a list of check marks, and, you know, you just have to make sure that you've checked all the boxes, and the best case is when you can just test out of most of them. You know, it's not a serious, holistic, integrated thing, and I think that we need to start there. And I think that the best way to approach that is to engage in something sort of like what Mill calls experiments in living, right? So an honors program, start small, see what kind of integrated, holistic curriculum that you can come up with, a curriculum that reflects, or at least tries to reflect, certain basic commitments about the liberal arts. And see how it goes, right? See, I mean, my not just hope, but my belief or my prediction would be that it's going to go extremely well, actually, if it's done correctly. There are models to imitate. We should think about doing this. And then once you have something smaller, you can think about completely revamping your gen ed, right? So that the first 2 years of university education are not about specialization and expertise, but about a liberal education, right? Which, again, strives for a kind of universal knowledge. And then you're going to go into whatever your area of expertise is. I'm not against expertise at all. But I want you to have the right foundation, right, for doing that in a better way. Precisely so that you are aware of the limitations of your expertise. That when you are looking at something, you know, as a particle physicist, say, right? I find this example so interesting because here you have a super famous physicist talking about what is most noble, right, for him to pursue. Now, he doesn't get that claim from within the discipline of particle physics, right? There's nothing in particle physics that's going to get you to this idea that, like, knowledge is good for its own sake. That has to come from a different sort of discipline, namely philosophy. And I think that if you have that general foundation, then you go into your discipline with a certain kind of self-awareness and humility and looking out towards the whole that would actually make you better as an expert, right? So that, I think, that's where we want to go. You know, I think we can walk and chew gum. Like, I think we can do both. I think we can have, the best case scenario is when you have a university that is dedicated to the foundation and also research.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. My question is, do you think that truth is completely in our nature? And if so, are we born searching for the truth, or is it determined by other individuals' perception of the truth and what they tell us is true?
Okay, so you're born naked and screaming and yearning for like a breast. That's how you're born, right? So, so no, you're not born searching for the truth, but you are born with the potential to search for the truth, right? But it comes later. And it also, again, there's all this habituation that's like prior to that, right? That's necessary. So I would say that you are born as the kind of thing that will pursue truth, right, unless impeded in some way. And you can be impeded materially. There can be something wrong with your brain or your central nervous system or something like that. You might have some kind of sensory integration disorder that makes study incredibly difficult for you. But that's a kind of impediment. You might be impeded by your culture, right? You might live in the kind of extremely authoritarian culture that doesn't really allow for genuine inquiry, right? That just says, this is the thing. You have to believe. You have to obey, right? And maybe, like, let's just for the sake of argument say, okay, yeah, like a lot of the things that they're forcing you to believe are true. But unless you are able to freely inquire, you don't really understand it, right? So, philosophers will distinguish between kind of like accidentally getting the right answer, right? And getting the right answer through understanding. Like you understand the reasons why the thing that you take to be true is true. And that's what you want, right? That's what you're looking for. And I think that the desire to have that and the conditions that are kind of necessary for that kind of inquiry to be possible, that's something that we have to preserve, right? You have to preserve. Because again, while you're born with a certain nature, it has to be cultivated. And that's where we get like our entire concept of culture, right? Is how do we cultivate that nature? And we know for a fact that there are certain cultures that don't allow for passionate dedication to the truth, because the truth, it can be very inconvenient to people in power.
Hello, thank you for your lecture. I really enjoyed it. The whole time I was thinking about asking myself what the role of professors is in this kind of truth, and you ended up answering it a little bit at the end in terms of how to facilitate truth. But do you have more specifics about what a professor can do to do that? Like in my high school experience, that was making classes entirely discussion and no lecture.
Right.
And since then, it's been like offering counters for every like source we have. We have a source that defends the opposite. Or like, what can they do?
Yeah. So I think I certainly wouldn't want to dictate to a professor of engineering like how they should run their classes. So let's just talk about the way that I think that general education should work. I think so. I was privileged to sit in on one of David's classes earlier this morning, and it was seminar style. Everyone was gathered around the table. Everyone knew one another, and it was a dialogue. It was an exchange, right? And that's the model, I think, for kind of general education, where students are very actively participating in the dialectic, the giving and taking of reasons, and the kind of like what we're doing now, right? Like I've presented a view, you have questions, you have objections, you have concerns, right? I always try to be very happy about objections, right? Even when, you know, maybe I don't know the answer or the objection looks devastating. But the thing is, like, whenever somebody, like, really strongly and forcefully objects to a view, even if you've got, like, nothing to say, and even though it kind of makes you feel bad or stupid or whatever, it's actually good, right? It's good that people are engaging your ideas. And it's an opportunity, it's not a crisis, it's an opportunity for you to get clear. Maybe your view has to change slightly in light of the objection. Or maybe it turns out the objection doesn't quite land the way you initially thought. But that kind of give and take, that is what is necessary, absolutely necessary for you to make your beliefs your own. I mean, one thing, I'd never done philosophy. I didn't really know what philosophy was. You know, like I could like name some philosophers going into college, but like I didn't understand what it was. And one thing that philosophy showed me very, very quickly, and it was very shocking, but what it showed me is that most of my beliefs weren't mine. They weren't mine. Like I had them, but it turns out they were someone else's beliefs because I didn't know why I believed what I believed. Even things that I believed very, very strongly. For example, I was very strongly committed to the idea that God doesn't exist. It was like a huge part of my identity. But when pressed, like I couldn't defend it against a lot of different arguments. And this was like very destabilizing. It was very shocking to me. I was like, oh, I thought like all right thinking people thought this, like what, you know, but I didn't have the answer, right? I didn't have the account. I didn't have the logos, you know? And that was a kind of crisis for me. But it was an extremely productive crisis, right? It was an excellent opportunity for me to realize, like, I am not nearly as smart as I think I am, right? And that's the, you know, Aristotle says the beginning of philosophy is wonder, but Plato says the beginning of philosophy is humility. They might be related, right? Probably they are, but, you know, it's that realization that I don't actually know what's going on. None of these beliefs are really mine, right? That's when you realize, like, I need an education, right? Like, I really need an education. And, you know, I'm still doing that, right? I realized that, like, I loved being in crisis, so it's fine. Not everyone feels that way, but I was like, oh, exciting. But yeah, I mean, that's what I think it has to be. No matter what you're doing in the classroom, it's got to make room in general education for dialectic. That give and take of free inquiry, and it's not, you know, it's not an unaided give and take. Like it has, and that's really the job of your professor, is to keep the dialectic on track and to guide it and to be like, well, that's not really a good objection, or maybe this is a better way of stating your point. Sort of like your professor, in a way, is sort of like a midwife, right? I mean, they're just there to help it along, because it's a natural thing, right? But even that, as natural as birth is, it's also scary and hard, and you really need a midwife.
Thanks so much for sharing with us. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that kind of one of the central claims that you're making is that not only do we need to know the truth, but the truth really is not just about knowing things, but living well, right? That the truth is is enabling us to live a life that is conducive to human flourishing. So my question is, what role, if any, does the university have in articulating perhaps exactly what constitutes human flourishing or living well? And I ask this question because there are radically different visions of what the good life consists in, right? And so what role does the university have in articulating that vision of the good life?
Yeah, so sometimes actually a lot of the time, when you talk about truth, the specific form of resistance that you get is that, well, everybody disagrees about what truth is relative to these sorts of questions. And so it can't possibly be the job of the university to simply teach the truth. And that's actually true, right? It's not, right? Because again, if I just sat you down, that would be like training, right? Where I say, this is what human flourishing is. This is what racism is. This is what gender is. This is what, justice is, right? But that's not philosophy. It just isn't. Philosophy asks dialectical questions that admit of opposing answers, right? Because if it's not, look, lots of questions aren't dialectical. Like, what time is it? That's not a dialectical question. It's an important question, but it's not very interesting, right? The question of whether time is linear is an interesting philosophical question, right? So I think, it's not about teaching truth. That's not at all what I'm saying. That's why I'm insisting that truth is an end, right? It's the goal of inquiry. But but the truth is, like, no university is gonna come to the point where they're like, well, we've got truth, so let's pack it up, right? You're not gonna exhaust that, right? And that's something that Newman is really great about. This idea that, like, look, the idea that, like, your finite lizard brain is really going to comprehend everything is absurd, right? And that's why it's actually good that you sort of are, like, working in your part of, the mine, as it were, so long as you recognize that you're involved in this much bigger endeavor, right? That you're always sort of looking out to the broader horizon of truth. So with respect to disagreement, disagreement is inevitable. I think it's fine, right? Like, it's fine for me if people disagree about all sorts of things. I think that one thing that universities need to get better about is, one, their commitment to truth as an end, that sort of governs the whole endeavor, but two is helping students disagree better, right? And that all will come from actually getting serious about what good inquiry looks like, what good dialectic looks like, and what are the habits, right, that are necessary for that to go well. Right? We don't, insofar as we talk about what a good classroom environment is, we're mostly looking, like, at external things and not internal things, right? And the things that I think are fundamental are, again, things like humility, things like civility, things that are necessary for people to learn together as a community, in which everyone has a seat at the table, everyone has something to say, everyone is recognized as someone whose contribution matters, right? And when we talk about, freedom in the classroom, I think we need to think of that freedom as exercised in accordance, again, with certain virtues that are necessary for liberal learning, right? So again, I would certainly say that civility is a big one, right? You have to respect the other people in the room. And that respect has to be reflected in the way that you're talking to them, right? And that is a reasonable expectation for universities to have of their students, is that they demonstrate civility to one another, that they can navigate debate. But I don't even like the word debate, that they can navigate disagreement, right? Because debate, in a way, is sophistry. You're just trying to win an argument by any means necessary. That's not what's really valuable. What's valuable isn't winning the argument. What's valuable isn't beating your opponent or winning the argument. That's all about status. What's valuable is getting to the truth. And that's something that, in the best case, you're helping one another to do, right? But that involves being able to listen to one another, being able to hear one another, being able to interpret one another, treating one another with respect, being humble, not being certain that you're correct, right? So many, a lot of people are extremely certain that they're correct. And I don't know why. It's sort of like, maybe you're not, actually. And I think that really the job of the professor is to try to model, right, the way that good discourse goes, to try to help it, to bring it back when it's going off the rails, right? And that takes more than cleverness, right? That takes more than smarts. That takes certain habits that I think professors should also have to cultivate.
Hi, thanks. So I guess I'm curious about two things, but I think they're very related. So the first is, in speaking of Wittgenstein, like you may say it's raining, I may say it's drizzling. Like what does that do in the pursuit of, can truth be rescued from Wittgenstein, from Derrida, from Foucault, from the masters of suspicion? And if it can, how does a teleological view of truth as it regards human activity not result in some sort of violent hegemony, at least at some point in the future, assuming we don't all die from global, climate disaster. At some point in the future, how does a universal truth not result in cultural hegemony or hegemony of knowledge or anything like that?
Are you worried about so what are you worried about? Can you just be more specific about the worry?
Yeah, I guess if we're speaking specifically in Aristotelian view of the good life and a pursuit of the good, how does the good, and for Aristotle, the use of rational capacities apply to, say, my brother who has Down syndrome, or to how does that reach across the board of humanity?
Yes, excellent. So sadly, I think Aristotle himself doesn't really allow for people with disabilities. I mean, Aristotle I love Aristotle, but he said some things that are just kind of gross, So women are stupid and need to be ruled by men. And he says all sorts of things about the happy life that I think aren't true, right? So Aristotle thinks famously that there's no chance you'll be happy unless you're beautiful physically, which is an interesting thing to say because we know that Socrates was very ugly. So I don't really know what to make of that, what point he's actually making there. But then he also thinks you have to have a certain amount of wealth. And he also thinks, frankly, that you just kind of need to be in the Hellenic world, right? If you're a barbarian, that is to say you don't speak Greek and just go bar, bar, bar. That's where our notion of barbarian comes from. It's not, not only are you not flourishing, but I think Aristotle basically doesn't really care. when I speak about Aristotelianism, I'm not saying that everything that Aristotle said was true. He says some really weird stuff that I think is obviously false. But I'm thinking of just a general way of thinking about things. And there, I think, Aristotle is incredibly productive. With respect to persons with cognitive disabilities in particular, rather than physical disabilities, I think that the correct answer, and here I'm shifting to a later form of Aristotelianism, like the kind that you find, say, in Thomas Aquinas, is that for any human being, no matter how disadvantaged or disabled or in any way kind of outside the norm, for any human being as a bearer of human form has a certain kind of inviolable dignity and worth. Now, for Thomas Aquinas, that has a kind of theological inflection because he believes that in virtue of having rational capacities, we are made in the image and likeness of God. He's getting that from Genesis. Aristotle doesn't have that view, but Aristotle does think, interestingly, because Aristotle's God, remember, is thought, thinking, thought. He does think that thinking, and in particular the kind of thinking that is contemplative, is the most godlike thing in us, right? So I think that there is room for saying that anyone who has human form is thereby, a full member of the human community. And sorry, my voice. Need my tea. Oh, but I'm afraid to walk over there, so I'm just not going to do it. Anyway, you're just going to have to deal with my voice cracking. That when we talk about their flourishing, we need to be recognizing them as full members of the community, right? As people with inviolable dignity and worth. And when we go about the business of evaluating their lives, that's what we keep first and foremost in mind, right? Is that regardless of what they can accomplish, right, that we recognize them as members of our community that deserve our love and care as much as anyone else. Yeah, what a great question. In the Callipolis, where there are philosopher kings, of course. I think that, of course, I think that politicians can pursue the truth. I do think that they face certain obstacles, right? Because politicians, at least in our contemporary context, are sort of selling themselves, right? And they're selling themselves to, because we have this kind of two-party system, they're selling themselves to very diverse constituencies, and they sort of have to, right? I think it's complicated for them. I do think that politicians have a duty to be forthright and honest about what they're up to. I think, politically speaking, I think they need to speak the truth about their agenda and what they're going to do, and that they have to be held accountable, right, for any discrepancy between what they say they're going to do when they want your vote and what they actually do. But I guess I sort of think in the rough and tumble of political life and a democracy, like there's a certain amount of obfuscation that sort of goes on of necessity. I'm not saying it's good, but But sure, they absolutely should be pursuing the truth. I mean, in order to really answer this question, I have to make a distinction between truth and practical truth, which probably we don't have too much time to get into, but there is a kind of truth that Aristotle speaks of that reveals itself in action, right? And that is the kind of truth that you see in the person who's actually living well, right? And that's a different kind of truth, Aristotle thinks, than the kind of truth that you get just in study. I do think that politicians, one, need to be people of good character. I think that character matters, and that has to do with how I think about political prudence. Obviously, that's something that many people disagree about, right? They think, well, it's just all about power, and you just have to get your guy in power, and then all they really have to do is advance the political agenda of the party. I don't think that's correct, because I believe that legislation, for example, requires a certain modicum of wisdom, right? You're going to make bad laws unless you have a certain amount of political prudence, and likewise, you can run a similar account for the judiciary. And again, I don't think you get political prudence for free, right? Because it's not just about your mind or your cleverness, but it's also about your character. So I think there's a more complicated story there, but I do think that we should at least hope for politicians who say what they mean and mean what they say and have a modicum of wisdom about how things in a just society should be ordered. And I think that if we totally give up on that and that we just make it into a power calculus, we're bound to lose as citizens ultimately.
So I'll ask, maybe selfishly, the last question.
Okay.
And so I think one thing that a lot of people, a lot of students, and many faculty too in the contemporary university think a lot about is justice. And about justice as kind of an aim or maybe even the aim of the university. And I guess I want to try to invite you to reflect a little bit about how you think about math, potentially in relationship to something very directly related to what you sketched out. That is, it seems to me it's one thing to be the sort of person who recognizes the internal good of a given discipline or practice, who cares about the truth as a student of the truth, but or to take the physicist who sees this as a noble pursuit. But it's a very different thing how that person actually conducts the fullness and wholeness of their life. So maybe they're eagerly pursuing that truth while they're horribly neglecting their friends and their family. And if the goal of the university is a kind of formation that is reaching beyond the love of the truth that we see exemplified equally between the person who is virtuous throughout all of her life and the person who maybe loves the truth especially well in her discipline or across the liberal arts, but is a horrible person. How is the university supposed to relate itself to those people? And might not it be asking too much of the university to want the university to weigh in on that other matter? That's my effort to tie that to this
Okay,
justice
yeah,
question.
okay. So there's a lot going on there. So let me just clarify that.
It was really two questions.
I know. The university is not the kind of person that you become is ultimately up to you, okay? It's ultimately up to you at the end of the day. And so in that sense, virtue can't be taught, because virtue is an expression of freedom. And so you have to want it, right? But that doesn't mean that we just give up on formation, right? Now, the way that, so I don't think that the university can make you charitable or wise or just, right? However, I do think that the university can impart good habits of mind in the recognition that good habits of mind don't come for free, right? And so again, it's up to you. I mean, your professor can model, right, what the intellectual life should look like. And in the good case, your professor models it well. Of course, we know in many cases they don't, right? There are many cases where I will just be like, don't act like them, right? And they might be great scholars. But that's scholarship, right? And that's, I mean, there's nothing stopping you from being the best Civil War historians about smells, for example, which is like a real thing, by the way. And also like there's no relationship between that and being just, right? So you could be the foremost expert about the way the Civil War smells and be an abusive person, right? That's a completely possible reality. And I don't think that's especially surprising, right? And I don't think, I mean, I think that the university has to police its professors insofar as if the professor is bringing the bad character into the community of learners, then that will be a problem for the community of learners. And so then it will be a problem for the university if the professor is abusive to his students, for example. If the professor is running a classroom in which people feel incredibly disrespected, for example. All of that is a problem for the university, right? If the professor is just, you know, doing all kinds of stuff in his personal life, that's not necessarily, right, the job of the university to police that. So I think, right, we naturally separate these things. But I also think that if you were thinking about hiring a professor and you learned that, like, I don't know, they're just incredibly abusive in all these other contexts, it would make you stop and think, right? And the reason why it would make you stop and think is because you recognize that this is a community of learners, right? And that you need to be a certain way to be a really good participant in a community. And I think that one of the things that has gone wrong in the research university is that we've so prized scholarship that we have overlooked some things that we clearly should not have overlooked. And a lot of people have gotten hurt because of that. And I think that's bad. Yeah, I think that's bad.
All right, let's thank Professor Frey.
Feel free to doom scroll. Or be happy, however that turns out for you.